I'd like to welcome everyone here this afternoon. We're very pleased to have you to our Archives Awareness Week event. And I want you to know that this program has been going on since 1992. Is that correct, Jennifer? Yeah, so it's a long-standing program, and it brings together lots of historical societies, museums, and cultural venues in our city once a year for a week. So this is our special week in celebration of the city's birthday also. Today we're going to do a couple different things. We're going to have a program in this room followed by a tour down the hall in the museum. So we're very excited about that. Our program today is Folklife and Folk Songs, Sources of Community Memory, with two professors that have paired up for us, Charles McGraw, Groh, and Rodney Shores. So I'll give you a brief bit of information about them, and then I hope you'll join us next door in the museum. And if you have a sticker on, if you don't have one, just raise your hand and we'll bring you one. That will allow you admission into the museum for free today, and we're open till 5 o'clock. So we hope you'll enjoy it. First up, Charles McGraw Groh is a very favorite professor of ours. We've been working together on exhibits and programs for the last few years, and they've been outstanding. And he's uncovered some super valuable historic information on different people who were associated with the Tampa Bay Hotel, so it's most exciting for us. His background, he did his undergrad work at Georgetown and got his PhD at University of Connecticut. And he is our current guest curator for the Booker T. Washington exhibit, and he's going to guide you on a little tour after this. And we also have Rodney Shores with us. Professor Shores is a lecturer of voice and music here at University of Tampa, and he has collaborated with us on several of our past exhibits and brought his students in to perform, and they are just amazing. Wait till you hear these voices. It's outstanding. In the community, Rodney is deeply involved with the Tampa Bay Lumina Youth Choirs, and also he's a principal accompanist for the Master Chorale, so you may see him about in the community. Well, I'm going to turn it over right now to them, and if you have questions afterwards, we'll be happy to answer a few of them before we go over to the museum. So thank you for being with us.
Hi, everybody. It is so nice to be doing this in person. I love Archives Awareness Week. It's such an important opportunity for us to be a community. So I'm so grateful that you all are here today. Let me go ahead and just dive right into this because we do want to make sure we leave time for the museum. So our exhibit that is on display, When the Train Comes Along, Booker T. Washington at the Tampa Bay Casino, uses Dr. Washington's visit to Tampa in 1912 as a window into two interrelated phenomenon. The first is the spread of formal racial segregation across the city. And the second, very interrelated, is the process of Black community building. And I will point out to you that I am referencing Black to mean both the African-American community and the Afro-Cuban community in Ybor City and West Tampa at that time. So as we celebrate Archives Awareness Week, I want to start off by talking a little bit about the challenges that the traditional archive presented to telling our story. And I think that that's something that is pretty obvious. If we're going to talk about archives, you have to recognize that historically, only some people's stories have been included in the archive. Only some history has been considered worthy of preserving. So it's very easy in Tampa to study Teddy Roosevelt. There's a lot of other people, it's not the same experience. Obviously, that relates to the communities we're talking about today. It relates generally to the study of women in Florida. There's a variety of different constituencies that we could refer to. Now, that's very much changing, but I think we have a long way to go. Part of this, and fortunately, and some people in the audience could speak actually so much better to this, digital technology is somewhat changing this, but it's also sometimes been very hard to use the archive because even when material does exist, it tends to be buried, right? There's not usually a subject file that says women in Florida, right? There's a subject file that says the mayor, right? So you don't know that the material is actually there. So that certainly has been something that has presented some challenges to us. And it makes it so important, I think, that so many repositories, and I think you're hearing something about this week, are so focused now on trying to actually preserve more of our community experience, And so hopefully moving forward, that's going to be an easier process. So we are going to talk a little bit about an archive today, but it's not in Tampa. The most important archive for this particular story is actually in Washington, D.C. So all of the research that was used to begin this project is research from the Library of Congress and the Booker T. Washington papers. Fortunately, as an African American in the United States, Booker T. Washington was exceptional. His papers were considered to be worthy of preserving. Right? So as I said, they're housed in D.C. And we're particularly fortunate that he was somebody who kept meticulous records. And so part of what he did was to preserve the correspondence with the communities where he toured. And so there's much more information about the Black individuals in our exhibit in D.C. than there is in their home in Tampa. Right? And so that's really important. So unlocking this puzzle to tell this story was really something that we owe to the Library of Congress. And if you look on the screen here, what you'll see are a couple of things that are actually located in the room. Since there's so many people, it's going to be hard to point out a lot of individual things to you in the room. But when you first walk in, you'll notice this display that you see on the left-hand side of the screen, which is a letter from Booker T. Washington to Reverend Perrin, who was the person who actually provided housing to Booker T. Washington while he was here, since Booker T. Washington could not stay as a Black man in a hotel. And so we have that correspondence, and I think it's so important that you actually get to see it. You'll notice on the right-hand side of the screen that there's actually an iPad that's located in the exhibit. There's so much material from the archive that we couldn't actually put on display, and so we've included it in an iPad so you can go through and see that these are the kinds of materials. So it allows you, I think, some direct engagement with the archive. Right? What could be better on this particular week? So in any case, that begins our story. In terms of sources, the next thing that I want to draw your attention to isn't something that some of you might necessarily think of as an important historical source, and that's Sanborn fire insurance maps. The particular one that you're looking at, this is also a wall of the exhibit. This is a compilation of 11 or 12 maps from 1915. And this was really important for us as we began to tell this story. So you'll see what we did. We created this map, and then we located all of the people whose names appeared in the Booker T. Washington papers who were part of organizing this visit. Okay, so placing them on a map was really an important step in helping us to define community, where people went to church, what businesses they frequented, all right? And then, of course, when you look at the small number of blocks that it actually took us, it's a very small area when you go and take a look at it. One of the things that you'll also get is some clear visual documentation of the imposition of segregated space, right? The Black community is becoming very concentrated in a specific neighborhood. So this map actually tells us a lot. It also tells us something else, and that's suggested by the streets and neighborhoods that you see on the map in 1915 that no longer exist. And as some of you probably know, between 1957 and 1968, federally funded highway projects, other urban renewal programs, destroyed physical Black communities in cities across the United States. Now, that's a huge topic and not something that I can adequately address in a couple of minutes. Obviously, these initiatives tore apart existing communities. Right? But today, what I want to focus on is the fact that there was a huge impact on community memory. Physical spaces, very, very important to how people remember. Community memory is something that is invested in shared spaces, so churches, beauty parlors, right, restaurants, neighborhood homes. So as historians, history practitioners, people interested in history and archives, we've tended to think about preserving important architecture, right? We've got the best example right around us. We've given less importance to the community memory that's attached to more ordinary kinds of spaces. And so when we demolish those spaces, we get rid of the anchor to which communities define themselves. And so that's something that's so important that we endeavor to recover. So when I say things like where people went to church, right? These are important things because they help us get a sense of what community was actually like. I will tell you, if you have not been to Perry Harvey Park, that is definitely something that you should do because that park does a really wonderful job of recreating a sense of space attached to some of these neighborhoods alongside Central Avenue, and specifically some of the places that have otherwise been lost to us. Now, if we turn back to our exhibit, the last slide that I want to show you here are a couple of family photos. I was really fortunate to conduct an oral history interview with a man by the name of Bentley Plummer, who's the descendant of J. Andrew Williams, one of the community members who appeared very prominently in the Washington papers. And it's definitely the case that the story of one family cannot tell you the whole story of Tampa's African-American community at this time. But the fact that we do have a record of the struggles of this family to open their own businesses under segregation, to raise their families, to contribute to their community's religious life, social life, professional life. This is all intertwined with the community at a really important moment of change, and so it does actually help to fill in some of these gaps in terms of community memory. So I would definitely ask you to pay attention to those things as you are walking through the exhibit. And that's because the most important part of this, our information gathering didn't stop when we opened the exhibit. The most important use of these photographs and other kinds of objects are the conversations that people are having in front of them, right? Because they are things that elicit memory. And so people are talking about things that they didn't think other people thought were important, right? And that's what we're here for, right? That's what this project is actually all about. So it is our work together of collective memory. Right? And so I really want to encourage everybody who's here to make sure that they become a part of that, right? If you're interested in Archives Awareness Week, this should be your project, That's why you have homework, by the way. Okay, so it can definitely be a project. So what I've actually given you falls within the area of Folklife. Which is a practice used in museums, historical sites. Very much the Smithsonian Institution, I think, is at the forefront. And what this project is to really try and identify people in communities who can tell stories, who have knowledge about their communities, that comes from years of experience, that comes from information that's been passed down from their parents and grandparents. This particular exercise I've given you is something that my students do with their families. It's also something that they do in retirement centers. And I think that also helps you to think about, what is community, right? Church is a community. Municipal organizations, ethnic institutions, community. A retirement center, community, right? And so all of those places have stories that hopefully we can preserve and kind of pass on. Now, I say Folklife in particular because when we talk about memory, I think what we're most interested in is how does this knowledge change over time, right? It's not like, oh, what was this important thing that happened in 1912? It's why did these things continue to be meaningful? Okay, I'll give you an example with the particular exercise that I gave you, which basically says, choose something that does actually convey history in a meaningful way, right? The wedding picture of your grandparents. Right? One of the ones I love the most are family recipes. They tell you so much about who people are and how they remember their family experience, right? Things change over time. And understanding those changes is, I think, a really, really important project in having a sense of what the past means to communities. So that's definitely something that I would encourage you to engage in. So attack your family, right? I said other kinds of institutions. Now, you'll notice in our exhibit, one of the customs that became very important for us to study was actually spirituals, since there seemed to be a lot of community memory and importance attached here in the African American community to the kind of shared performance of music at important functions, like Booker T. Washington's talk. And so that really became an opportunity to have something that clearly these songs had changed over time, right, since they originated under slavery. And they continued to have meaning to how a community defined themselves. And that's something that certainly continued to happen after 1912. Now, we're clearly outside of my area of expertise, so that will be your introduction to Dr. Shores.
Thank you, everyone. I'm just going to switch PowerPoint slide programs quickly. And as Dr. Groh was saying, we want to look at one of two spirituals that my students here at the university were able to give attention to over the last year and a half, actually, in various ways of preparing for participation in this particular exhibit. And one of those pieces that we were able to look at last spring was actually a piece entitled "Until I Reach My Home." And as Charles was saying, this particular song grew up on the plantation, being sung by slaves in both community events and worship services, as you might imagine. And it literally went through hundreds and hundreds of iterations. But perhaps, we're not absolutely certain, but one of the first printed editions of Until I Reach My Home that we find occurs in this collection called The Book of American Negro Spirituals, written by James Weldon Johnson. There's some dialogue and some history on the songs themselves. But then also, these songs had to be transcribed, as you might imagine, because they were passed down orally. They were sung, they were sung, they were sung. But someone eventually, if they were to be preserved, had to actually write them down. And that task fell to J. Rosamond Johnson, who actually transcribed this piece. J. Rosamond Johnson is also famously known for writing the anthem, "Lift Every Voice and Sing." And so what you're about to see is his rendering of one of the first printed versions of Until I Reach My Home. And as you can see, I really want to point out that Johnson goes out of his way to actually preserve the dialect that is in the piece. I'm going to see if I can see it over here. You'll notice, "Until I reach my home, until I reach my home, I never expect to see my journey over." Couldn't see there. "Until I reach my home, true believer on." He goes out of his way to leave that dialect in the piece. That's a whole nother topic. Like, there's so many things that we can actually talk about around that, obviously beyond the scope of today. But as we were talking about, you'll notice that Johnson actually had to make his best guess when he's writing this piece down, because it was different every time it was sung, you might imagine. Like, impurities in the melody that were difficult to actually sing would just kind of be filtered out by whoever was singing them the next time. You'll notice there are no harmonies written. There's just a melody and Johnson's best guess at what a reasonable piano accompaniment might be, and that's because the harmonies would also change, contingent on who was actually singing them, what the service was, what church was singing them. Was this sung on the spur of the moment at a community event or something like that? But the only thing that we know is that the melody was relatively consistent. And so community memory develops. And so by the time the Civil War is over, we see a movement towards trying to preserve some of these pieces. And the Fisk University Jubilee Singers mount a tour of the United States and Europe where they attempt to popularize some of this music. A very interesting thing begins to happen. There's a movement known as the concert spiritual movement, where the basic melody and text of the music is actually kind of used as base material for more formal choir arrangements, literally composed in Western style using Western methods of composition to create a concert spiritual. And this was, of course, presumed to kind of make the spirituals more accessible to the general public, i.e. the white public, right? And there were some really wonderful things that happened during this movement. If you've ever heard a spiritual sung by a choir, that's what you're basically hearing. Some really unfortunate things happened too, because depending on who actually made the arrangement, some of the really extraordinary, improvisatory, exciting things that could happen in the moment kind of were lost, and the arrangement became kind of square or boring or kind of, just bland. And so that's what begins to happen. More recently, in fact, we can actually see that as styles of worship have changed in black communities and black churches, this modern arrangement of Until I Reach My Home reflects a more standard gospel style. And we'll say more about that in a little while. Because the hope and inspiration and courage that were passed on in a piece of music like this actually cannot be restricted to any one musical style. And we'll explore that too in just a second. When you consider that an extraordinarily oppressed group of people that were under a tyranny of like this intense suffering, injustice, exploitation, and abuse, a whole group of people for generations found solace, strength, and courage as they sang this music based on the situation that they were in. And they found this courage on at least two different levels. This, for me, is some of the most fascinating part of these spirituals that preserve memory. The people that sang these songs almost always, not always, not across the board, but almost always found that meaning on at least two different levels, right? What we call in theological language a polysemy or polysemous language, several meanings, different layers of meaning. In music like this, it was not uncommon to talk about reaching your final home, getting to heaven when you die, crossing the Jordan River into the promised land of Israel, using Jewish references from Torah. But that was only part of the story. Sure, the people singing the music were excited about passing on to peace with God at the end of time. But they were also talking about the home that they would reach when, good Lord willing, they actually were able to cross the Mason-Dixon line. Or maybe actually cross the border to Canada, where not only would they be done with their awful journey and be reunited with their loved ones who had been taken from them, but maybe they could actually own a home, right? And could actually reach their home one day. Meaning was changing. And so we find that the metaphor for freedom doesn't just stop there with freedom from slavery, right? As Paul Ortiz says in his book, Emancipation Betrayed, African Americans tried to stay alert to the ways that past struggle was related to their current striving. And so making it to the other side of home means something very precious when slavery is abolished. It means something very different while they're waiting on the 15th Amendment, the right to vote. Home and freedom means something different, living through the era of Jim Crow laws. Home means something very different in the metaphor when they're waiting for the Civil Rights Act to be signed. Home means something very, very different, protesting in the streets over the unjust murder of African Americans at the hand of police officers in 2020. The journey home is rooted to the experience in slavery and grows up in the community through very many different situations of stress, of pain, of suffering, and encourages, yes, centuries and centuries of hope and joy and deliverance, all wrapped up in a piece like Until I Reach My Home. And as we talked about earlier, in a piece like Until I Reach My Home, there's no one particular style of music that can fully encapsulate the hope, joy, strength, and courage that are experienced. And as you'll see, this setting that I'm actually about to play for you a tiny clip of was set by Dr. Brandon Boyd, who is currently Assistant Professor of Choral Music Education, Choral Conducting, and Music at the University of Missouri. This arrangement takes the melody that I sang for you in rather crude fashion just a few minutes ago and sets it through the lens of the concert spiritual into a modern-day gospel setting. And what you'll hear in this little clip, you would expect to hear in a modern-day black worship service, maybe in a Baptist church where you would have a piano, a bass guitar, a lead guitar, a drum set, and a Hammond B3 organ, right? It would be perfectly at home in that setting, but it's the same melody that for literally centuries, it's the same text that literally for centuries, it's the same spirit that literally for centuries has inspired strength, courage, hope, and joy, and given a vision of liberty to a group of people in a community. So in closing, you're about to hear a clip from the University of Tampa University Chorus, or at least a small ensemble. There were a lot of COVID restrictions still in place in the spring. We had to sing in smaller groups, spaced out, and with masks. And the clip that you're about to hear is that arrangement that I just showed you by Dr. Brandon Boyd, and it was filmed just what are my bearings, across the way there in the music room. Thank you. I have no sense of direction. Dr. Groh knows this so well. But we hope you enjoy hearing this little snippet, and thank you for joining us today. Here's a clipping from a video of the University Chorus singing Until I Reach My Home.
Thank you. What an enjoyable program. Does anybody have any questions? No questions? You ready for the tour? Okay, if there aren't any questions, take your time and come straight out the back doors, down the veranda, into the museum where you see the flags, and we will meet you in the exhibit room. And thank you again for being with us. We appreciate it.